Good evening. Welcome tonight to our panel discussion on the topic of Memoirs and Memory, U.S. Grant's Literary Legacy. Our programs are normally porch programs, and one of our presenters actually brought the porch in his background. So Chris, I thank you for that. That makes me a little more comfortable this evening. I'm Mary Flanagan. I am on the Board of Trustees and the Secretary. Also with me tonight is the wonderful Colette Brossler. She is in charge of our marketing and development, and thankfully is here in the event that I have an IT problem with, at my age, I would probably just fall apart. She's here to save the day. These programs are possible due to generous donations from our sponsors, memberships, and donations. To learn more about becoming involved in Grant Cottage, please visit our website at grantcottage.org. Tonight's panelists are streaming from their homes. We have tonight Dr. Chris Mikowski, who has the porch with him. He is the managing editor of the Emerging Civil War book series and blog. He's a professor of communications and he's assistant dean at the Jandoli School at St. Bonaventure University. His work is widely published and he's been featured on multiple television programs and is author of 9 books, including Grant's Last Battle. Also is Dr. Andre Flesch. He's an award-winning author and associate professor at Castleton College with expertise in the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. He has been published multiple times and has been featured on C-SPAN and is the author of The Revolution of 1861, The American Civil War in the Age of Nationalist Conflict. And Ben Kemp, our very own operations manager for the Friends of Grant Cottage. And he's been with us since 2014. Ben is an avid U.S. Grant researcher, a living historian, and presenter who was featured on C-SPAN, PBS, and the recent Grant documentary series that was on the History Channel. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks for having me, Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'd like to start out tonight with a few questions that will be addressed to all on what your thought is on these subjects. Did Grant write his memoirs himself, or did someone else ghostwrite for him? Chris, we'd like to start with you.
That has been an unfortunate question that has plagued this fantastic book for its entire history. Grant himself not only wrote the memoirs, but had this great epiphany while he was writing them, where he discovered the pride of authorship. And so he was very protective in his final weeks of the fact that he wrote this book. His publisher, Mark Twain, who is sometimes given credit for writing them, was also very protective of the idea that Grant wrote this book. Unfortunately, that has dogged this book ever since because it was besmirched in the press. Grant's aide, Adam Badow, who had helped sort of serve as a fact checker and as double set of eyes, contributed to a controversy that suggested Badow was actually the ghostwriter. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But no, 100% Grant wrote this book. It is all him, and it is fantastic.
Thank you. Andre?
Well, I concur, and I suspect Ben will too. I hope tonight we can dispel, that old canard that Grant did not write his memoirs. The evidence is overwhelming that he did. Scholars have manuscripts written in Grant's hand. He first developed his thoughts in articles that he wrote for the Century Magazine series, well before Adam Badow or Mark Twain became involved with the project. We have accounts from his families that each night he would read sections of his progress out loud, and review what he had done that day. His son Fred also helped with copy editing, fact checking, and research. As I'm sure we'll discuss. I think Adam Mado wished he had written it. He himself had a book on Grant's campaigns and fancied himself a literary man, and I think was worried that Grant might steal some of his thunder, and was actually dismissed from the project after he had suggested that he had been one of the primary authors. Clemens, Mark Twain, as we know, acted as a literary agent, but always vigorously denied having any major influence on the text itself. So I think the evidence is quite clear that Grant was the author.
It says your internet connection is unstable.
So I'll field that question as well. I do concur with Chris and Andre. I logged into a Civil War forum, Civil War Talk, and there was a thread regarding the authorship of Grant's memoirs, and it had 350 posts. So this is something that does, this myth, it has been perpetuated for a long time, and I can understand where it comes from. Grant was very, very sick. It's hard for people to believe that someone in his condition could complete such a literary work, but not everybody had the endurance and fortitude, deep fortitude that Grant had, and of course the intense devotion to his family. And I think that also all has to be accounted for. We know what the human body can do when it's pushed by those forces. So I don't think his physical condition would have kept him from being able to complete this task. All the evidence leads to Grant being the author. Others that took part in the project were simply editors, fact checkers. His son, Fred, Adam Badeau has been mentioned. Mark Twain did very, very little editing, proofread some of the Gelly proofs, but there's no evidence of ghostwriting. As Andre mentioned, there's in the Library of Congress, you can look at them. There's pictures of the original manuscripts you can look at online. You can see Grant's handwriting. It does get unsteady at times as he gets sicker. And it is in the hand of Fred or the stenographer at times as well when he had to dictate later on. But the whole nature of the way that it reads, the dialogue, how it goes together, it's all the same person writing this. Mark Twain was very busy at the time. He did not have time to ghostwrite it. And Adam Badeau, I think, he was, as Andre said, was very challenged by the situation that Grant's book was putting him in. And, that his own book, books on Grant would be sidelined by the popularity of Grant's work. So the evidence just isn't there. It's not there. There's room for some little bit of speculation, but not enough to make any kind of conclusion that
We're freezing again.
that he was not.
We got to turn some of this off.
So I think there's no evidence there, and I'm feel completely confident in agreeing with Grant. Let me read a quick quote here. This is Grant's own words, July 16th. This is days before his death. I first wanted so many days to work on my book so the authorship would be clearly mine. Since then, I have added as much as 50 pages to the book, I should think. So if people think he was in this picture, wrong side, that picture, sitting there pretending to write his memoirs in his final weeks, then so be it. That's your conspiracy theory. But I'm going to go ahead and stick with the evidence.
I love Andre's use of the word canard. And I think one reason that this has persisted really ties into the development of the lost cause myth, because in order for Lee to be the great hero, Grant has to be undercut. And one way to undercut him is, this full court press against his reputation that happens throughout the 1890s and on into the 20th century. And so one way to undercut that is to take his knees out about his authorship, about the book that basically defines what the war was all about for the Union veteran. And so if we can discredit that and undercut Grant's credibility there, that also undercuts a huge compelling argument about what the war meant in the first place.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. By the time the memoirs came out, there was already this lost cause narrative that was developing that portrayed Grant as a mindless, unthinking butcher, who just hurled numbers at Lee. I think there was also an element of East Coast literary elite, thinking that how could this soldier from a ordinary family in the Midwest, write a great literary work or be capable of doing this. So yeah, absolutely, the lost cause is key, and I definitely want to return to that subject.
And I just before we move on to the next question, I think there's a situation here of honor and honesty. And I think Grant put those things at a high standard. And when he let Adam Badeau go from the project because he wouldn't blankly refute that he was ghostwriting, like the press said, Grant said, "My name goes with the book, and I want it my work in the fullest sense. I do not want a book bearing my name to go before the world, which I did not write to such an extent as to be fully entitled to the credit of authorship." So I think Grant, was a man of honor. I think he was a man of honesty, and I don't see him and the people around him perpetuating a conspiracy to defraud the American public. I think he was helped a lot by his editing team. He needed it. It's a massive work of literature, but I don't see another author's touch in any of this.
Thank you, Ben. We've been unfrozen. We were freezing up here a little bit, but I think we've corrected the problem here. We will start with Andre with this. Did Grant ever intend to include in the memoirs the last 20 years of his life, including his presidency, or why not?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'd say probably not, possibly not. We certainly know that, in Grant's own words, that the presidency wasn't a period that he particularly enjoyed, and so he may not have wanted to revisit that. It's also important to keep in mind that the memoirs originated as a Civil War project, right? The idea for Grant to write the memoirs was floated after he began writing articles for Century magazine about Shiloh and his other experiences in the war. So certainly the public interest was mostly focused on the war. We also have to contextualize Grant's memoirs as part of an entire literature of Civil War reminiscence that, by the 1880s had begun to flower. So, I think that the war was probably always intended to be the focus, but I should say that there are some really interesting tidbits in the memoirs. So I am tempted to think that maybe if he had more time, he might have developed those a bit more. First of all, he clearly discusses, his belief on what the war reconstruction in his presidency brought. He lays out his vision of a multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy, which is what he believed the war had created. He makes that quite clear in the memoirs. He also has a long section on his involvement in the effort to acquire the Dominican Republic in the memoirs. And that effort failed, and he was criticized for it as very controversial at the time. But Grant believed that not only would acquiring Santo Domingo help U.S. strategic interests, but he also saw it as part of this Reconstruction era policy in which the United States might imagine being a multiracial democracy. As he says in the memoirs, if the U.S. had acquired Santo Domingo, it would have eventually become a state that would have had a large African American population, and also very likely sent African American senators and congressmen to Washington, and he supported that vision of the United States. He also talks about his belief in the emergence of the U.S. on the world stage in the post-Civil War era, and really begins to foreshadow this special relationship between the U.S. and Great Britain. As you all may know, there was quite a bit of tension between the United States and Great Britain during the war, but in the memoirs, Grant emphasizes his belief that the U.S. and Great Britain should form a special relationship, that these were countries that had a heritage and a political heritage in common, and the history of the 20th century obviously showed how astute he was in thinking that. So there are some really interesting tidbits in the memoirs that maybe he would have developed if he had more time. But I do think that both he and the public were probably most interested in the war years.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, I have to agree with Andre. My research into the discussions Grant had about writing his memoirs with Century Magazine, who was working on the 4 Civil War related battle articles that Andre mentioned, that all points to the project being, he had worked on these battle manuscripts, these battle articles, and then they were going to form a basis for the memoirs. So he was going to go, he had a plan to go back into his childhood and then up to the end of the war. And that was really the only thing that was planned that I've been able to find. There was no plan to go any further than the end of the Civil War. Although, as Andre mentions, he wraps it up, at least in some sense, wraps up in his concluding chapter some items that definitely reference post 1865. So there's a little bit in there. I wouldn't say it's worthy of the 20 years that he left out, but no, I don't see any evidence. At first, he was only going to do 1 volume. They were going to try to get it into 1 volume and then maybe 500-600 pages. Of course, that turned into 2 volumes. And by the end of the project, he was already over pages, according to Mark Twain. So obviously he didn't, the myth out there is that Grant died before he could finish his book. But the reality is there's no evidence for that at all. In fact, Twain was trying to rip the book out of the man's hands, but he knew it was keeping him alive. It was he knew the importance of it. So no, I don't see any evidence for that. You say, why not? Why wouldn't he write about the end of his career? As Andre said, it's what the publisher wants. You go with what the public wants, which is what the publisher wants, which at that time was a war memoirs. They were working on the battles and leaders of the Civil War series for Century Magazine. That was a focus point. But that was just what was selling at the time. And political memoirs were apparently boring at the time, I guess. But I would say that would Grant have gone on and written more? He did, as Chris had alluded to, he did find it actually a fulfilling vocation once he got into it, writing. He didn't think much. He was very humble and did not think he'd make much of a writer. Didn't think much of himself in that way, and he lacked a lot of confidence. But I think the confidence he developed during this project may have allowed him to go and write about that period of his life if he so chose. But it's hard to say whether he would have or not. After that, the money the one book made, I don't know if he'd even bother. But maybe a book about horses. I don't know.
Thank you, Ben. And Chris?
Because when he leaves office, he basically has this farewell address that says, "I tried my best," and so he doesn't leave the office in great accolades or in high spirits. And I have to say, as a historian, I wish he had written about it, because I think history would have been kinder to him if we'd have been able to understand his 8 years through his own words. That said, he didn't have enough time to write what he was writing. One of, I think, the most illuminating pieces of pencil talk that he leaves behind is he says, I would have fleshed out Spotsy and North Anna if I had time, and I would definitely write more about Cold Harbor. And historians have looked at his short selection about Cold Harbor and sort of condemned him for making those charges that he always regretted. And obviously they must have been a disaster, or he would have written about them more. It's like, no, he's dying of cancer. He's struggling with cocaine addiction. So he's got all this stuff going on, and he's surrounded by people whose hearts are breaking. It's a terribly difficult writing environment to be in. And so he says, like, there's so much more about the war that I would want to write if I could. I'm just running out of time. And just to kind of echo what Ben and Andre were both saying about this being a war memoir, that's what got him started in the first place. Twain had his eye on that as the objective from day one. He told Grant that everyone in America will be morally obligated to buy a copy of this book. Because it explained what the war was all about. And so it was really that war focus that Twain knew people wanted, people were hungry for, and that's why he really wanted to keep the work focused on that. I will say too, his round the world trip would have also been a pretty interesting volume had he been able to write about that. People talk about the missed opportunity or lost opportunity of the presidency, but then he spends 2 years going around the world as America's goodwill ambassador and the most famous man in the world. I really would have liked to see his perspective on that. Young's book about the 2 years is pretty cool, but geez, to hear about that from Grant's perspective would have been fascinating.
Thank you. The next question, we will start with you, Ben. What signs were there in Grant's earlier career that he would accomplish such a literary work?
Well, there's both general signs and, more specific signs of his ability. The general sign would be, perseverance, to be able to complete this project in the condition he was in. Obviously, you had to see a man that was had the ability to push aside all sorts of distractions, including intense pain. Someone that could be intensely focused and had just an incredible reserve reserve to be able to complete something like this. So I think you have some basic character traits that work towards him being able to accomplish this. But in a more specific sense, he always was able to take disparate information from his different commanders, the staff members, and he would just sit there and listen to them and take in all this information. And then he could combine it all to make along with studying maps, to make his battle plan or his strategy. And I think the ability to do that, because a lot of his memoirs were written out of order. His memoirs were written out of order because of the century articles. He had to go back and fill things in. And then a lot of times he would remember events, but not necessarily in order. So he'd remember, he had a great memory, but sometimes they'd be out of order. Like Chris said, he was dealing with medication, he was dealing with pain, but he still had that great memory. So the memory was a huge part of it. His clarity, his ability to have a clear message come through anytime he wrote orders. So I think, and he wrote his own, speeches as a president as well. Not that he liked to speak in public at all, but he got better at it, and I think that was part of it too. Public speaking, as both Chris and Andre can probably attest, helps to some extent with writing too. Being able to think clearly, think on your feet, and being able to deliver that information too. But I think the biggest thing was what George Childs said, Grant's neighbor at Long Branch, New Jersey. He bought Grant a cottage next to his, and they spent 20 years together. He was one of Grant's closest friends, and he simply said that Grant was a great storyteller. Nobody knew this because he was very shy when you first met him, but when you got to know him, the man opened up, and he was a great conversationalist, had a lot of wit in his stories, humor. So the people that were closest to him, his friends and his family and some of the officers he served with, that he was very close to, knew this guy had an ability to tell a story and to tell it clearly and in an engaging way. But that had never made it to paper before. He had never put that on paper. In fact, his first article was on the Battle of Shiloh, and the Century magazine got it. And I guess one of the editors was so disappointed in this dry military report that he actually said this may be the new disaster of Shiloh. So it was a very dry military report. He knew Grant could do better. and especially after he went and visited with him and found out that Grant was a great storyteller. He just got Grant talking. He went down to Long Branch, this editor from Century Magazine, he got Grant talking. He said, every time Grant would tell a great anecdote or story, he said, put that in the article, put that in the article. And that's eventually how he got Grant to become a more personalized in his writing. So Grant had the ability. I think it was already there. He just had to receive some direction and some coaching from, the man's name was Robert Underwood Johnson, an editor at Century Magazine, but that's who came down. So he had that ability to be a great storyteller. It was just hiding there the whole time. He just didn't use it until the very end.
Thank you, Ben. Chris?
There's this wonderful moment in the midst of a terrible moment at the end of April 1885 when Badow, the story breaks that maybe Badow was the writer of the memoirs. And Badow presents Grant with basically a blackmail letter saying that if you pay me extra money, I'll say that you're the author. And Grant has this epiphany. And he writes about it later and says that I realized at that moment that through my entire military career, I had written all my own orders, which had been lauded for being clear and immediately understandable. When I was president, I wrote all of my own correspondence that was typical for someone of that office to write for himself. In fact, I've been a writer my whole professional career. And he hadn't ever thought of himself as a writer with a capital W and the elbow patches and the pipe and all of that sort of thing. He'd never thought of himself that way. But he had been writing clearly and effectively his whole career. And so this crisis moment with Badow and the blackmail letter helps Grant realize this sense of pride of authorship. And that's when he really turns the table and he's like, he just lambastes Badow, refuses to back down. And we've talked a bit about how important that pride of authorship was for Grant. So he didn't even recognize the breadcrumbs in his own career up to that point until that moment of crisis. But they're all there. And through that lens of hindsight that we as historians have today, we can go back and see all that stuff pretty clearly. But it really took that moment of crisis for it to come clear for Grant himself.
Thank you. Andre?
Yeah, I concur with everything that's been said. I think that, certainly some of the best evidence that Grant wrote his memoirs lies in the orders that he wrote as a military commander. Not only are they known for being clear and direct and concise, but they also have a literary quality to them. I mean, I've just picked out a few examples of orders that he wrote during the war. Here Grant is explaining to George Gordon Meade the plan for the 1864 campaign. Lee's army will be your objective point. Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also. And it's showing some of that, that direct language that he's known for. Then, of course, there's the famous line when he writes back to Washington from Spotsylvania. I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. And then with a little bit more flourish, right, he explains to Henry Halleck his vision for the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. He said that he'd like to see the US troops, quote, eat out Virginia clear and clean as far as they go, so that crows flying over it for the balance of the season will have to carry their provender with them. So, as some historians have said, he was a literary figure before he even knew it.
Thank you. Our next question, we will start with Chris. What kind of writer was Grant? Was his literary style typical or unique?
I guess it depends on how we want to parse all that. I would say that, having read a lot of other correspondence and official reports by his contemporaries, I would say that he's clearer than most of the other officers who are writing in the Army at the time. As far as a memoirist, I would say that he is certainly has something stronger to say. He's got the 30,000 foot view that a lot of memoirists at the time didn't have. And I think that's one thing that makes him pretty unique. But I think that Twain, as one of the leading arbiters of literary taste of the day, as he's reading over those memoir sheets, he's saying it's a masterpiece. He compares it to Caesar's Commentaries. He says that it needs hardly any editing at all. He's just thrilled with the clarity of the prose, the insightfulness of the prose. There's not a lot of literary flair to it necessarily. Andre came up with a couple good examples. Those tend to be few and far between as far as literary flair in Grant's work, but the clarity, the conciseness, the insight, the sequence of events is, his sequencing is all really strong. And so I think those are things that make his writing style stand out. Twain tells his friend William Dean Howells, this is a masterpiece. Wait till you read it. And indeed, Howells does read it later on and reviews it for Harper's and calls it a masterpiece. Twain wasn't being hyperbolic when he said that.
Thank you. Andre?
Yeah, I think that Grant's literary style is very unique for its time. When you read the memoirs, it almost has a modernist style that's very different than the flowery 19th century language. In the memoirs, Grant achieves almost this conversational tone and in a very understated and humble tone, in some ways keeping with his character. And these qualities weren't lost on thinkers of the 19th or the 20th centuries. In fact, Gertrude Stein was an admirer of Grant's memoirs. Some reviewers lauded the memoirs for unveiling a unique American voice, a democratic voice, rather than using very flowery, high style language that was convened at the time. When I read the memoirs, you almost they almost sound even a bit like Hemingway or styles that we read in the 20th century. And I don't think that's an accident. I mean, you have to remember this is one of the most read books of the 19th century, certainly one of the best-selling books of the 19th century. And so all kinds of Americans would have read some or all of it. And I think that, just speculating here, but I mean, a great line of research, how did Grant's memoirs affect writers of the 20th century?
Thank you. And Ben?
Yeah, I agree with both Andre and Chris that really the writing actually reflects who Grant was. And one of his contemporaries said that his greatness actually resided in something that people didn't really pay attention to, which was Grant's simplicity. And that wasn't he wasn't being trying to say Grant was a simpleton. He was saying Grant had a simplicity about him that really appealed to the average man. And of course, he was dedicating these memoirs to the soldiers and sailors, American soldier and sailor. So certainly not all of them were the most literate men to the point where they could, read this, as Andre said, flowery or romanticized, writing styles of these other commanders and memoirists of the period. So I think Grant, his great simplicity, as Chris said, is clarity, and just it's oozing with his humility. There's just he's not a self-promoter. I mean, some of these guys were really trying to promote themselves with these books in different ways, and you just don't see it in Grant's case. And I think his literary style, because it's so clean and so simple, it allows you to basically you're standing next to him in battle. It puts you in his perspective very easily, because it's not romanticized. There's a little bit of wit and a little bit of humor here and there and some turn of phrase, but it's not a humorous book, and it's certainly not a romanticized view of war by any sense. So I think that is indicative of Grant's pragmatic nature. and practical, his practicality. And those things, I think a lot of his nature comes out in his writing. And I think you can learn a lot about Grant through the way that he wrote.
Mary, if I could just add real quickly, Ben brings up a really great point where it's not humorous. And that'd be one thing that would, a lot of people think of when they think about literary style. It is a deadly serious book. He is writing about the Civil War, but you'd be surprised at how many soldier memoirs actually do sneak in a fair amount of humor in what they're writing about. If it's episodes that they happen to see that were funny, or they work in some snark about people. There's some fabulous snark in Civil War memoirs. Grant is playing this pretty straight. And I think that ties back to, as Ben said, his humility and his simplicity. So that's, I think, a pretty important defining feature of that style.
Thank you. Our next question, we will start with Andre. How do Grant's memoirs compare to the literary style of other military contemporaries who wrote theirs? And how about later military memoirs?
Yeah, well, to answer that again, I think it's useful to go straight to the text. As we've said, in response to the last question, there's really a striking difference in style and tone to what conventional 19th century writing was in general, certainly memoir writing. So I'd just like to compare two passages. The first is from the memoirs of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, right, who many Americans are familiar with for his role at the Battle of Gettysburg, but he was also at the surrender at Appomattox. And here's how Chamberlain describes the surrender. And this I would take to be fairly characteristic of 19th century memoirists. Chamberlain says, "Our earnest eyes scanned the busy groups on the opposite slopes." He's talking about the Confederates here. "Breaking camp for the last time, taking down their little shelter tents and folding them carefully as precious things, then slowly forming ranks as for the unwelcome duty. And now they move. The dusky swarms forge forward in gray columns of march. The momentous meaning of this occasion impressed me deeply. I resolved to mark it by some token of recognition, which could be no other than a salute of arms. Before us in proud humiliation stood the embodiment of manhood, men whom neither toils and sufferings, nor the fact of death, nor disaster, nor hopelessness could bend from their resolve. Standing before us now, thin, worn, and famished, but erect, and with eyes looking level into ours, waking memories that bound us together as no other bond." So that's Chamberlain.
I feel like I should have hummed the Battle Hymn of the Republic underneath you.
Exactly. So there's Chamberlain. Now here's Grant describing the surrender. "What General Lee's feelings were, I do not know. As he was a man of much dignity, with an impassible face, it was impossible to say whether he felt inwardly glad that the end had finally come, or felt sad over the result, and was too manly to show it. Whatever his feelings, they were entirely concealed from my observation. But my own feelings, which had been quite jubilant on receipt of his letter, were sad and depressed. I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly, and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse." So there's Grant.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, I have to, go back to what I had said before and what Andre's so wonderfully illustrated in those passages is that, Grant does definitely have a different style. And as I mentioned before, he was not in it for self-promotion. I think Grant wanted to do, he said in he said in the preface that he wanted to produce a work that was acceptable to the reader. Grant was always looking to please, whether it be, someone around him, a veteran that needed money, he would give him money on the street. He wanted to please the people and help the people around him. So he saw worth in something, I believe, he saw worth in something that would be worth something to someone else. So it would be worthwhile. And so I think there wasn't ego there. There wasn't self-congratulatory, or romanticized, writing that you see in other memoirs that slips into other memoirs. So I would say I think Grant, was really trying to just give an honest record. That's what he says in the memoirs. He's just trying to give an honest record. He does allude that there is a growing narrative. I don't think he wrote it to correct the record, but he did see this other growing narrative, which of course, as has been stated, became the lost cause narrative. But certainly people were looking to him to define that war for them, especially the veterans. They looked up to him as a father figure, and the people of America, many of them looked up to him as the savior of America. So there was a lot of respect. And so I think many of them were looking for him to define what it meant, why they served, why the men around them died on the battlefield. I think there was a certain hope that he would give some definition. And he says in one of his final statements to the GAR that, in a very touching moment, he says that I'm writing this for the boys in blue, so that they can follow along in the battles that we fought together. So Grant was certainly writing it to some extent, for posterity, but certainly his main reasoning was just to make money. But he certainly saw the purpose in giving an honest account if he could. And I think that honesty, that at least that attempt at honesty certainly comes through in the pages. And sometimes other agendas, I think, got mixed into the memoirs of other figures, both contemporary and in the future.
Thank you, Ben. Chris?
I think, kind of building on what Ben just said, I think that realization comes to Grant through the writing process, because he had resisted the invitation to write his memoirs before on many occasions. And it wasn't until he and his family faced financial disaster that he's got a financial incentive to write these memoirs. And as he begins to write them, then he starts to discover he actually has something to say. And so that epiphany that he comes to, so by March, when Congress restores his pension, he really doesn't need to finish them from a financial point of view. But by that point, he realizes that he does have the opportunity to define something, to say something, to leave something to posterity. And so he finishes because of that drive. It's no longer financial. I think if it was just financial, his body probably would have given up on him long before it did. But because he suddenly has this very existential need to follow through with something to say, that really keeps him going. I'm kind of following along on the Facebook feed here. I see Jane Ashley said, I haven't read the memoirs, but this talk has me interested in reading them. Yes, go read them. They are fantastic. I think all four of us here on screen would say they're just wonderful to read. I'll give you, look at it. See, I've got a copy right here on my desk too. I'll compare them, just to go back to Mary's question about how do they compare to other works. Sherman's is a good example. Since Ben's waving his copy, I'm going to wave mine too. Sherman had written his memoirs, and he writes, a pretty straightforward, serviceable memoir. He quotes extensively from his own correspondence during the war, which tends to be a real drag on the narrative flow of that book. And it doesn't particularly do all that well financially. So when Grant's offered the chance to write his memoirs, he almost doesn't, just because Sherman's wasn't that big a deal. So, I'm not really going to make a lot of money off mine either. And, Twain finally persuades him otherwise. But Grant, who also quotes from his own wartime correspondence, does so much less frequently. He does so in ways that are important as references, but not as substitutions for the narrative as Sherman does. So I think the book holds together much better compared to Sherman's, and I think that's why it does so much better.
Thank you. We will start with the next question to Ben. Would Grant have ever written his memoirs if it has not been for his financial disaster?
Well, I think Chris has alluded to that already. He had resisted numerous times. He had been approached, I think the best illustration is when Grant is just about, I talk about a fateful event. Grant is just about to put pen to the paper in the fall of 1884 to sign a publishing contract with Century Magazine. And who knocks on his door but Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, his friend, and Grant is just about to sign that piece of paper, and Twain says, "Can I at least read it first, General?" And of course, he lets him read it, and immediately Twain starts disparaging. He says, "This is 10% of the profits. What you're a famous man. You deserve more." And the ever modest, ever honorable Grant says, "Well, I've been working with Century for months. I should really go with them." And Twain was able to pull an ace out of his pocket. He says, "Well, General, if you remember, a few years ago, it was in 1881. A few years ago, I had lunch with you, and I asked you to write your memoirs then. So technically, I came to you first." Twain had even pestered Grant in the past about writing his memoirs. This man was incredibly modest about it. He kept telling people, "There's books enough already," he said to a reporter. He said, "Badeau has already written my military history. I don't want to harm his books. He had already mentioned, that he didn't think he'd be much of an author, didn't think the book would have any sale. He just had no confidence in himself. Everybody knows that Grant was very self-effacing. So to have that 180 when he gets sick, when he loses his money, to have that 180 from writing to not writing, Grant is the one that reaches out to Century Magazine, actually. And it's because they had reached out to him before the financial collapse, not long before, just at the end of 1883. They had asked him to write his memoirs and some articles. And so they knew if Grant wrote articles, then they could get Sherman and Sheridan to write some too. And Grant did send a letter to Sherman telling him and Sheridan that they should write articles for Century as well. So they knew it was good to get Grant on board. But Grant did it. The timeline fits. He did it for his family. He did it because of the financial disaster. That was the defining initial reason, and it was the overriding reason throughout the project. As Chris said, the other things filtered in. He began to enjoy it. He began to see it as his duty. And as you know, when Grant saw something as his duty, there was no turning back. He was going to finish no matter what. And he pushed himself to survive long enough to do that. So I believe the overriding main reason for his writing of the memoirs, bar none, was financial. But there was other things mixed in, an honest account for posterity, and to put in his remembrances down as well, and in a bit of an enjoyment and a diversion to keep him not thinking about his illness. So there's little things that mixed in, but it was definitely money.
Thank you, Ben. Chris?
Yeah, we all talk about Grant's memoirs as being so fantastic, and we really should thank him for Battles and Leaders as well, because when Century Magazine wanted to launch their series, they knew that Grant had to be the first guy. If they couldn't get Grant to sign on, it wouldn't have the credibility that they felt that they needed. And so he first turned them down when Johnston reached out to them. And so they thought, well, okay, that's that idea. So really it was when Grant then decides to sign on after his financial collapse that the project takes off, and we've got 4 volumes of fantastic primary source material as a result of that. So really it was Grant willing to finally go ahead that really helped us. The finances were a problem for Grant throughout this, not just his own personal finances, but he didn't really have any business sense at all. And in some ways, having Twain come in, Twain went to great lengths to protect Grant's financial interests, to protect Julia's financial interests. They actually assigned the copyright to Julia so that Grant's creditors can't come in and try to swoop away proceeds from the book. Twain really goes to great lengths to protect Grant's financial interest throughout the process, goes to Century and renegotiates Grant's contract with them. So instead of $500 a piece, they're going to pay him $2,000 a piece for each of those articles. Twain's also going to take care of any lingering copyright issues so that Grant can use what he's written for Century as part of the memoirs so that he doesn't have to rewrite it as he's dying. They're already up against this deadline. So Twain really comes in so many instrumental ways to protect this project, to protect Grant's legacy, and to protect the family's finances. That's sort of an undertold part of the story that Twain deserves immense amounts of credit for.
Thank you. And Andre?
Yeah, right. I mean, if we believe Grant himself? The answer is no. He wouldn't have written his memoirs, as has been explained. I mean, he had resisted, getting involved in the memoir industry, as it were. But to return to a point that Chris made earlier, I'm glad that he did, and I think he probably was too. I think once he started writing, he realized that he could correct the record. He could begin to weigh in and answer some of the pro-Confederate memoirists that were out there, combating the lost cause. Hopefully we'll touch on later. He talks about the causes of the war, in which he, of course, firmly attributes to slavery, and he refutes a number of other memoirists that had been writing at the time. So we're indebted to Grant to have that counter narrative. Because I'm sure, as many of you are aware, the pro-Confederate historians and memoirists for quite some time kind of won the public debate. Certainly going into the early 20th century about what the war was. But we do have this record. So yeah, Grant himself said he wouldn't have if it weren't for the financial failure. But I'm glad that he did.
Thank you. We all are. We will start with Chris with this question. How did Grant's highly publicized illness and death affect the sales and reception of the memoirs?
It's a great question. I don't know that I've seen any specific evidence that talked about it one way. If you go with the old P.T. Barnum saying that there's no such thing as bad publicity, then all the news about Grant dying certainly heightened people's interest in the book and in the project and in what Grant had to say. And so, there's this great anticipation for this book to come out. But there was anyway. As I mentioned earlier, Twain had said everybody be morally obligated to buy a copy of that book. He was selling it by subscription, meaning he had people going door to door saying, hey, do you want to buy a copy of this before we even print it? And there were already enough subscriptions. So by the time the news broke of Grant's illness and the severity of that illness, there was already high interest in this project. So I'm sure that it intensified as a result of Grant's news, but I don't know that it necessarily drove sales or not, to be honest.
Thank you. Andre, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we need to remember that Grant was one of the most famous Americans of the 19th century around the world, right? Not just in the United States, but his travels around the world. He had been introduced to many world leaders. He'd been received by crowds everywhere he went. Enjoyed quite a bit of admiration. Certainly, his funeral was a major event, covered in all the newspapers. The funeral probably helped to draw attention to it, but I think there would have been tremendous interest anyway. Not only because of the subject matter, but because of how widely he was admired in the United States.
Thank you. Ben?
Well, I have to say, I think the power of sympathy it came into play here. I will say that I think that was a component, because if you talk about Mark Twain and his nephew-in-law running the publishing firm, Charles Webster, this is a letter, you might be able to see it here. Charles Webster and Company Publishers. This is June 16th, 1885, and this is Charles Webster sending a note to a prospective book agent. And many of these book agents were Civil War veterans. So you can imagine a Civil War veteran showing up at your door with his veteran's outfit on and asking you to buy a book that's being written by the dying savior of the Union. I don't know how I would say no to that. I think it'd be difficult, even if I was just a Midwestern farmer. I think I'd feel fairly pressured to get the piggy bank out and make a purchase there. You could $7 was considerable. That was the basic cost of, here's a sales slip from the Memoirs. This is for sheepskin binding. They had calf skin and different leathers and things for more money. It's $3.50 per volume, $7, $9, $11, $18 per volume. And they had little samples. You could see a little bit of the book. The salesman brought little samples and things, so it was really well done. I mean, Twain took an incredible amount of effort in micromanaging this stuff. He pushed his nephew-in-law, Charles Webster, to the limit physically to get this thing done. It was a massive project. It was the biggest book sales project in American history, I believe, up to that point, other than maybe selling Bibles. But so this was a massive, massive project. And I think I see in Twain two things. I see a businessman, but I also see a man that really wanted to help his friend. And I think I see both of those things. And I see, Twain at times being somewhat concerned that Grant won't be able to finish it. And that's the only allusion I've ever seen to someone else potentially finishing it, is if Grant literally died during the project, then they may have to consider that. But otherwise, there was no consideration. As long as he lived, he would be the author. And I think, Grant being in the headlines of national papers every single day, it had to have an effect on people and their name recognition. You drive down the road, you see a political sign on the side of the road. What's it there for? Just so you remember the name. And if you see General Grant, every day in the newspapers, with your morning coffee, you're gonna think. And then a guy raps at your door. Hey, you want to buy a book by this guy? He was just in the headlines. So I think the sympathy. Not that they played the sympathy card necessarily, but I think the sympathy was there, the sympathy of the nation, and certainly it showed in the massive amount of mourning across the country when he died. And they were still selling it. I mean, this letter is from June 16th, the day Grant went up to Mount McGregor. They have already put on their stationery, publishers of the Memoirs of U.S. Grant. So they are full on. I think the sympathy played a role in it.
Yeah, and I want to add just real quickly, because I always, as a historian, I'm like, I haven't seen any textual evidence. So leave it to Ben to pull out this cool artifact from the cottage. But it also goes back to Mary's first question about authorship. And notice that sales flyer says Grant written by himself. I caught that little blurb if you hold it up to the camera there real quick. So that was something that Twain is pushing, that, authorship is Grant's. So sorry to interrupt you there, Mary.
Good point. Our next question, Andre, will start. Can you think of examples of substantial inaccuracies in the work? Does your research lead you to a different conclusion regarding any of the engagements or individuals as compared to Grant?
Oh boy, so I have to lead off the controversial question. I think we have to start by recognizing that Grant wasn't a historian, right? That he was a participant and a memoirist. So he certainly had the benefit of some of his papers, of his orders, of the government documents that were beginning to be published, as part of the official record of the war. But he wasn't interested, as a historian would be, in citation and pointing us to the source of every one of his claims. And I do think that we do have to admit that Grant is not immune from special pleading in these memoirs. We have to understand that, as we said, and I think we all agree, necessarily he is responding to other memoirists, other writers that were arguing that Grant was not skilled, that Robert E. Lee was the greatest commander in history, that only sheer numbers accounted for the Union victory. And Grant, quite rightly, is refuting many of those points, but he does engage in some of the numbers wars. Certainly many pro-Confederate writers, but also historians since that time have challenged some of the numbers that he presents about troop strengths. He probably at times underestimated Union troop strength and overestimated Confederate troop strengths, for example, in the 1864 campaign, partly because he's trying to make the point that, there wasn't this, the disparity that many in the public were coming to believe. He could also be pretty harsh in his analysis, not necessarily inaccurate, but he could be harsh in his analysis of both friends and foe alike. He had, during the war, he was not a fan of George Thomas, for example, the Union general, and he doesn't shy away in the memoirs of pointing out when Grant felt he had come up short. Interestingly, on the Confederate side, he defends Joe Johnston, and I think that there's a bit of self-service going on there because of course, Johnston was one of the generals that he had to contend with in the Vicksburg campaign. It might serve Grant to make Johnston sound like a more formidable foe than he had been. Not to say that Johnston wasn't a skilled officer, but did not win many battles and campaigns during the war. He is, he certainly punctures the Lee myth, and I think that was necessary. But certainly people would debate that. So. There are a number of areas where we could talk about just how accurate we feel.
Thank you. Ben?
Well, I think Grant does himself a great service in giving a disclaimer in his preface. He says, "The comments are my own and show how I saw the matters treated, of whether others saw them in the same light or not." I think that's a pretty good disclaimer. I think most lawyers would say that's a pretty good disclaimer. So I think he's setting it up. He's telling people what memoirs are. I think that's really an important point here. So for me, it's not what he gets right, what he gets wrong. It's what's the intent behind it. And as Andre had alluded to, was his intent? It's hard to determine intent. That's why a lot of people go free and win their legal cases. But it's hard to determine that. So you say, well, maybe he was, boosting, Johnston, and there's a lot of speculation there as to why he would, portray a certain battle a certain way or portray a certain figure a certain way. But it's really hard to determine what the intent was. Even Grant at the end of his presidency says, I've made errors of judgment, not of intent. And I think, he's very pragmatic. He's fairly black and white in what and how he describes things. So if he saw something a certain way, he could have had bad information. Somebody, I believe, had put a question earlier about orders number 11, which was the infamous situation where Grant expelled the Jewish people out of the military district. And again, to omit something like that, what is the intent by omitting that? Why doesn't he mention Julia more? These things are all, omissions that can't be determined as to why. Was it just the amount of space he had? I know someone pressured him. I know from research, someone pressured him to add his father's connection with John Brown because they thought it was interesting. So he was pushed into adding a few things here and there. But as far as was he intentionally inaccurate? Was he intentionally misleading? It doesn't seem his style. Anybody could be prone to it, but maybe Chris has read it enough times to let us know if he thinks that Grant was just taking a little bit of liberty, or maybe trying to paint something in a little different light than maybe it happened. I don't know. I don't get that impression, but I'm not as well researched on the battles and figures as someone like Chris.
Go ahead, Chris.
One of the things I think is important to remember too is that he's dying as he's writing this. So aside from the very nature of memoir, which allows somebody to write things as they saw it, as Grant fesses up in the introduction. He's also dying and he's facing this deadline. And, and he admits in places, I'd write more, but I don't have time, or I would have people or events suggest themselves to me if I had the chance to go over this more. So, there's just a process of forgetting because he's up against this deadline that happens too. So it's impossible to tell, why does he leave out Special Order 11, which is a huge embarrassment to him. It could also be that, a memoirist is allowed to just skip over what he wants to skip over and write about the things that he wants to write about. So there could be that going on as well. Impossible to tell, and I would never second guess someone's intention along those regards. One thing I will do, just sort of as a public service, is point folks to a book by Frank Varney called General Grant and the Rewriting of History. And I know that there are some big Grant fans out there right now that are now booing that book because Frank's book is controversial. He does go into a lot of Grant's memoirs and tries to parse out he kind of gave, in that book particularly, he gave Rosecrans the short shrift on this or that, and here's why, and here's how. And so Frank is a Grant skeptic, but he is, Frank actually does like Grant, but he's a skeptic. So I would encourage people to look at that book for themselves, but also be a skeptic of Frank's book, as I think Frank would want you to be. And I think somewhere there in the midst of all that, you will find some instances where Grant maybe had been playing a little fast and loose, maybe just he had a grudge against somebody and so, was either not going to talk about him or he was not going to be complimentary. You could probably find some of those sorts of interests. But I really don't think there was a bone of malice in the guy. He didn't like some people, but I don't think he held a grudge against people. Even, the much ballyhooed problems that he had with Lew Wallace at Shiloh, the two of them came to some sort of agreement by the time Grant died, and Grant admitted, yeah, I guess I've come into some information I didn't have before, and there might be something to this. Grant was humble enough to admit something like that. I think that you can, if you really wanted to peel the layers away, you could find some places, but I really don't think we could prescribe ill intent. I think it's more a matter of execution.
Thank you. Ben, we will start with you. What impresses you the most about the work itself and the writing of it?
It's a great question. The work itself, as we've mentioned this evening already, is it just is so clear. It's so plain and so readable. And I think that there's something refreshing about that, about the realism, something that sucks you in, engages you, makes you feel like you're a staff member standing next to him while these battles are happening. It's so clear. It's almost like he's giving you the orders, or, that's the feeling I got when I read it. It was just, so understandable. You weren't in some fantasy land of romanticized war. You were there. You were there. You heard the footsteps, you heard the marching, you heard the guns going off. He did well at setting the scene too. He would, really describe the terrain very well, the setting, sometimes the sounds even, and certainly even some, some very difficult scenes, of carnage and things like that he would be very, it felt very honest, and I think that's what you want in a nonfiction work, is you want honesty. And I think he really tried to portray that. So for as far as what I appreciated most in it was his honesty and his simplicity, and I think that's what really made it readable and set it apart. His greatness was in his simplicity. It seems silly to say that, but and there's nothing wrong with being a poet or being using some more flair and things like that. But I think Grant, his style set him apart to some extent from his contemporaries. As far as the writing of it, there's just, it's one of the most admirable things I can imagine. It's what drew me to Grant Cottage in the first place, is the story of the final year of his life. He's going to give the entire year sacrifices what he knows at one point to be his final months to his family's future. I mean, you know, there's just such a powerful lesson in that, in devotion, in love of family, in dedication to duty. There's just so many layers there of what would expose just a great character underneath that was able to complete this. So it's more of the story of how he completed this work. Does that add or detract from the actual work itself? I don't know. I mean, it definitely drew me in. I think the work stands on its own. Some people say that as he got later into the memoirs, there was some issues as far as, you know, he was treating things. I think it was Andre mentioned something. He's treating certain things a little bit more briefly. Time was slipping away. So there is, you know, it may have affected it a little bit, but there's just still such honesty there. If that's the real reason why these, there's some difference in the way it was written towards the end, I think it's totally understandable given the circumstances. And as everyone's already said here, what's the alternative? There's no book. So we'd rather have a book that is honest and maybe have some errors and, you know, these other things. So yeah, just the unbelievable devotion to his duty, and it really reveals a character that shines throughout his life, but shines brightest. His son Fred says, my father was never so much the soldier or the man as in his final patient wait until the end. I mean, he just was so impressed. He had seen his father during the Civil War. He'd seen his father as a president, and this final struggle, this final act of devotion was his admiration grew more than it ever had before in his life. So I think that says something. So that's my.
Thank you, Ben. Chris?
I love the clarity of the book, that you can still pick it up today and it's as relevant and readable as it was once upon a time. I actually really admire the fact that he had a small team of fact checkers that were working with him. So as he's writing, his son Fred, his stenographer Noble Dawson, his daughters-in-law, they're reading over the manuscript and trying to help him make sure the factual accuracy. One of the things that you can see in both of the recent annotated versions of the memoirs that have come out by John Marsalek and Elizabeth Samet. Both of them spend time in their footnotes kind of doing some fact checking of the fact checking. So you can kind of trace some of that. Ben's got a copy of Samet's book right there. So you can, if you really want to get into the weeds, you have the opportunity to do so, which I think is helpful for those of us who are big nerds when it comes to the text. And then finally, the thing I really like about it is this great episode he talks about early on in the book when he's young, and he would walk someplace, and if he would miss the turn, he said that he would keep going rather than retrace his steps. He would keep going and come in through a different direction. And that idea that he would never turn around has become a perfect metaphor for his entire career, which I have milked shamelessly in all of my tellings of Grant's career. So that whole notion of no turning back when he crosses the Rapidan and heads into the wilderness, and no turning back when it's time for that third presidential term, and his resistance to write the memoir, I'm not looking back, and then he finally. So I mean, it's just been a wonderful, wonderful memoir, metaphor for his entire life.
Thank you. And Andre?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think what I like most about the book is the degree to which you feel like you're getting to know Grant the person. Now we could sit here and debate, certainly literary scholars would debate, is it the real Grant, or is this how he's choosing to portray himself? But, certainly you come away feeling that you know this person, which is always what makes studying history exciting, when you can get that sense. Certainly whether it is the real Grant or portrayal, self-portrayal, the book reveals many qualities that people claimed Grant had. On the one hand, tremendous insight, right, into others, and willingness to discuss his foes and friends' strengths and weaknesses, but also a humility and a willingness to be self-deprecating. In many places in the memoirs, you really feel that this is a real person, and you're getting to know him. And of course, obviously, his personal struggle in writing the book makes it all the more poignant.
Thank you.
And if I may, I just want to piggyback on that to make mention that you're talking about a story that in and of itself, many people find engaging. History Channel so much that they made a documentary. And that's what it is you've got a man that's got that rags to riches, he's got that, obscurity to national prominence. He's got that rise, that meteoric rise that really, the reader can follow. I mean, he doesn't go deeply into his early life, but just enough to give you a flavor of the very common, background he came from, and then this just incredibly, these struggles through the 1850s, and then into the Civil War. It just turns right around on a dime, and all of a sudden he's on the upward trajectory, and it just doesn't stop all the way to 1884 when he loses his money, but he still had the support of the people behind him even after that. So, just an amazing story to follow along, as through the war. And of course he ends on the crescendo, the Appomattox, he ends on the crescendo pretty much. So, you really can't blame him there. I mean, that was also a good ending point, it's better than, the Penniless, although, as everybody said, it would have been nice for him to treat that. We would have appreciated that as well if he went into his later career as well.
Thank you. And for the last topic, we will start with Chris, and I think we'll have time for some questions that we received both online and on the Facebook feed. So Chris, what do you think the memoirs add to the reader's understanding of the Civil War?
We have a first-person account by the principal surviving character of the war, and that is invaluable. Yes, it's a subjective point of view. It's Grant's perspective as he saw it and had the ability to capture it. But I think about how much poorer we would be about our own history and about this defining event if we didn't have Grant's perspective, particularly because, Lincoln dies before the war's over. Lee lives only a few years afterwards. So there's a reason why the editors of Century Magazine said, we've got to have Grant or this whole thing isn't going to hold together. And so having Grant's voice, having this book, having his inspiration for others to write pieces for Battles and Leaders, has just added to our understanding of that historical moment in ways that are incalculably valuable. I can't even say the word. It's so valuable. I can't even say the word incalculable. So.
Thank you, Andre.
Yeah, well, I think the reason, from a historical perspective, for an American cultural perspective, why this is so important is because Grant's memoirs provide a powerful response to what historians call the myth of the lost cause, or the tradition of the lost cause, and as we've touched on in this discussion. And just to review, the lost cause is the set of arguments that Confederates made after the war to shape American understandings of the war. And I think today, many of the tenets of that lost cause are still familiar to Americans. The war had nothing to do with slavery. The war was all about states' rights. Robert E. Lee was a military genius who was, by far the best general in the war, if not in American history. That the Union side was not admirable and only won because of overwhelming resources and numbers. Grant's memoirs provide a powerful response to those claims. Throughout the book, in his conclusion, he's very clear: the cause of the war must be attributed to slavery. He argues that slavery as an institution needed protections. White Southerners had striven throughout the antebellum era to control the US government to get those protections. He believed that they dominated Southern politics, for those very reasons. And once they didn't get their way, they seceded. Secession, he said, was revolution. He believed it was treason. This was not an admirable struggle, though he certainly has no malice, he says, for ex-Confederates. He doesn't want to celebrate their cause. He's very clear about that. He humanizes Lee in this memoir. Grant says, I'm paraphrasing, he said, Southerners and many Northerners, have kind of attributed superhuman status to Lee, but I knew him, and he was mortal, right? And without calling attention to the fact that he also lost. So, I think that those lessons they were important then, and they're still important today to understand that Union perspective.
Thank you. And Ben?
Yeah, I think that, Chris alluded to this, that to have a understanding of a period in history, what do they say? Sources, sources, sources. You're looking at fabric that's going to be woven into a tapestry, which is your understanding. The fabric is going to be made up of threads of different, a soldier's journal, and a woman on the home front who keeps a diary, and a general who writes a memoirs. So I think you have this combination of things, and so Grant is one component. I'm sure his modest opinion would be, oh yes, I've written this work. Hopefully it meets the expectations of the reader and helps people understand the Civil War. But he would also have said, don't just read my book. Don't just take my word for it. Read some of the soldiers' diaries. Hear their stories as well. And so I think his work is very important because of the role he played, as Chris said. But it makes it so much more powerful when you add in these other sources, and again, that's where any author can be challenged, just as Frank Varney did. Any author can be challenged, Grant, when there's other perspectives, that differ. And so Grant is a very important source, but it becomes even more important as you add other sources into the tapestry, which is the knowledge of the Civil War. So I think that Grant gave a very honest account. That would be, I think, his honesty, his attempted honesty, even if it is what was his perspective, because that wasn't always the case, as we have mentioned. So I think that's what I think is the thing that I took away mostly was I can trust this man. That's why they put him in the White House. He did stuff that the Americans could trust him because he showed himself trustworthy. And so when you have that kind of trust in someone, I think you really take what they say, at their word. And so I think he was a man of his word. So I think he offered a very honest and realistic view of the Civil War that definitely helps to add to the sourcing that we have for the Civil War.
Thank you, Ben. One of our questions that came online was, once Grant reached the cottage, how much longer did he live, and was all of his family with him? Ben, can you answer that one?
Sure. Grant arrived on the cottage on Mount McGregor on June 16th of 1885. He was already living on borrowed time. He was very weak. The doctors knew that he could pass away any day, any minute, any hour. And so he was able to push himself to survive, not being able to eat properly, having to sleep in chairs. He was able to push himself to survive long enough to finish the book, which is still the finishing of the book is still, the exact date is in contention. But it was sometime in the last week that he was there, which would have been the week of July 23rd, which was the day that he passed away. So you're looking at about 5.5 weeks he survived at the cottage. Now, his 4 adult children were able to be there most of the time with him. His 3 sons and 1 daughter. His wife, of course, was there with him the entire time. The daughters-in-law, some of them were able to be there, and some of the grandchildren stayed on the property as well. He had at least 3 grandchildren there. And he had 9 grandchildren at the time, but at least 3 or 4 of them were able to be there at given times during his final weeks. And of course, he was an absolutely devoted family man, loved spending time with his children. They got together every summer in Long Branch, New Jersey. And of course, he loved to play with his grandchildren. So he was the consummate family man, great grandfather and father. And of course, to have his family there with him at the end, they were a powerful support structure. He did not do well when he was away from them, psychologically and physically. So this is what I believe made the final weeks possible, was having them there for support. And certainly, anyone who knew that family knew that they had an intense love for each other. They were helplessly devoted to each other. So again, a very affectionate family, a very committed family. And I think that's because Grant was the center of it. And I think Grant really promoted that. He promoted respect and love in his family. And I think it really showed in those final months. There are sons that had prominent fathers that never attended their final days or final weeks because there was problems in the family. So it wasn't a given that the whole family would be able to be there with him. So that was, I'd imagine, a great blessing to Grant in his final weeks at Mount McGregor.
If I can just build on that for just a second, Ben, because earlier you mentioned that Julia doesn't show up in the memoirs all that much, and it does strike some folks as a curiosity, considering his attitude toward his wife. If you go and actually read the correspondence between them, which does survive, that is a man who is head over heels in love with his wife. He is crazy about that woman, and it's a wonderful love story to read their correspondence and get that view inside the relationship. And he was miserable without her. In November and December of 1884, as Grant had started writing as he had started writing the Century pieces, he goes into a very deep depression, and he has writer's block, and he can't work. And the grandkids are all there around him. And Julia at one point says, no, leave Grandpa alone. And he's like, no, let him come in. It was the one thing that kept him going in the midst of this deep depression as he's struggling through these stages of grief. And the kids would come in and they'd climb all over him. And it didn't matter that Grandpa was trying to work because Grandpa wasn't getting anything done. But that's really what kept him going through that period. And so it really made a whole lot of sense for everybody to be there in those last few weeks, because that's really what got him through those last few months.
Thank you. Andre, Clarence has sent this question in.
Okay.
How would you compare Grant's popularity and his death with other American figures?
Well, I think that, as I said before, Grant was one of the most famous Americans of the 19th century. And so his funeral was widely, covered, a major event. Many Americans at the time classed Grant alongside Washington and Lincoln as the saviors, the founder of the Union, and then the 2 saviors of the Union. So I don't think that is hyperbolic, to say that his death and his and the memory of it, rose to to those levels. Of course, Grant's tomb, right, in New York City was a very impressive structure that unfortunately kind of has been forgotten by a lot of Americans today. But 19th century Americans saw Grant as the savior of the Union that Washington had founded. And so they saw this as the death of a major American statesman, a major figure in American politics.
Thank you. And Chris, our last question of the night came from Bill from Newburyport, Massachusetts. And he asks, what impact do you think Grant's memoirs had on future military and presidential memoirs?
I think the fact that he doesn't write a presidential memoir is actually kind of a good thing for those who follow him, because they realize that there's a hole in the literature, and that actually inspires a lot of people to make sure that hole gets filled. And so you see like presidential libraries start to get built and things like that. So there's a conscious effort by his predecessors, by those who follow him, who try to make sure that that literature gets filled. As far as the impact on other memoirs, military memoirs, really Grant's is the standard. Caesar's commentaries had been the standard before that. Grant's comes along, and it really does stand as arguably the greatest work of nonfiction in American history. Published at the same time that Twain is working on Huckleberry Finn, the great fiction of the time. And so as a towering work of nonfiction like that, it really sets the bar pretty high. Military memoirs become a cottage industry. I mean, there were plenty of them going on at the time. I don't know of a single one that really rises up to the same level of Grant's, that transcends the genre in a way that Grant's does.
Thank you. Well, we have done our hour and a half, so our time is up. Thank you, gentlemen, for taking the time out of your busy schedule and joining us this evening and sharing your tremendous knowledge. Thank you again, and please visit Grant Cottage and look at our website at grantcottage.org. Good night.
Thank you.